The chamber of the Galactic Council was heavy with the sound of scoffs and quiet laughter when the ancient emissary rose to speak. Its skin was scarred from battles fought long before most present had even hatched, its eyes deep pools of memory and loss. In a voice brittle yet unyielding, it warned of a mistake that could unravel the very foundation of galactic order. The emissary spoke of humanity, small in number, confined to a young world and scattered colonies, but carrying a spirit that could not be measured in fleets or firepower. They told of an earlier conflict, a border skirmish long forgotten by most, where a fleet of their kind had underestimated humans and paid in extinction. "Do not provoke them," the emissary said. "Do not draw their ire. They will pursue you beyond reason, beyond time. Their vengeance does not wane, it consumes." The silence that followed was brief. Soon the council erupted in murmurs and mocking retorts. A handful of delegates shifted uncomfortably, but the dominant voices carried contempt. To them, the idea that humans could rival the combined strength of species thousands of years older was absurd. Council scholars dismissed the story as an exaggeration told by a race that had suffered its own decline. The words were recorded, archived, and quickly forgotten amid debates over trade routes and border disputes. The council, secure in its own superiority, could not imagine that a species so young could ever threaten the balance they believed permanent. Among the humans present in the chamber that day, the words struck a different chord. Their delegation had no power to sway policy, their votes barely symbolic in the face of larger blocs. Yet they listened to the warning in silence, their eyes hard, their posture straight. They were accustomed to being dismissed, accustomed to hearing their species referred to as reckless, volatile, and short-sighted. They bore it without outward reaction, but deep inside the lesson resonated. Humanity had always been underestimated, even by itself. And humanity had always been most dangerous when overlooked. The Council's arrogance was not born merely of pride but of centuries of domination. Species that had survived plagues, wars, and cosmic disasters came to believe that longevity equated to wisdom. They saw human ambition as a temporary flame that would burn out or collapse under the weight of its own aggression. They mistook human diversity for disunity, human stubbornness for ignorance, and human grief for weakness. They had never understood that humanity's contradictions were its greatest strength. Where other species fractured under pressure, humans grew sharper. Where others retreated from loss, humans pushed forward with fury. Whispers spread in private corridors even as the council dismissed the warning publicly. Some remembered isolated accounts of battles fought on fringe colonies where human mercenaries had turned the tide against impossible odds. There were stories of explorers who endured environments no council race would dare to tread, adapting in ways that seemed unnatural. Yet these whispers never reached the podium. No faction wanted to admit fear of a species still mocked as primitive. The council chose the comfort of consensus over the inconvenience of caution. The elder emissary, realizing its words had been cast aside, left the chamber with a heaviness that no one noticed. It had done its duty, given its warning, and fulfilled an oath made to ancestors who had been the first to fall before human retaliation. It knew what was coming, even if no one else believed. History, it thought, would not remember the jeers of the council. It would remember the fire that would come after. And so the seeds of destruction were sown not in a battle, nor in a declaration of war, but in arrogance. The warning was laughed at, the record sealed in digital vaults, the voices of caution drowned beneath the clamor of superiority. The council congratulated itself on its wisdom, secure in the illusion that destiny would always bend to its authority. Yet beneath the calm veneer of order, a shadow lingered. The emissary's words clung to the air like smoke after a fire, and in quiet corners of the galaxy, there were those who wondered if the laughter would one day sound like the prelude to morning. When the council turned its gaze back to ordinary business, when it resumed debating tariffs and boundary patrols, humanity returned to its colonies and its homeworld with watchful eyes. They said nothing. They needed to say nothing. The insult of dismissal was recorded not on paper or in archives but in the collective memory of a species that had always carried its grudges close to the bone. No one yet realized it, but the galaxy had just ignored the last true chance to avoid calamity. The Council's decision did not come swiftly, but when it came, it carried the weight of arrogance disguised as prudence. For years, factions within the chamber whispered that humanity's expansion was unsustainable, that their hunger for territory hinted at deeper instability. Small colonies sprang up on worlds that older species had deemed inhospitable, their air unfit, their soils toxic. Yet somehow humans thrived. Each success gnawed at the pride of established powers. Resentment turned into fear, and fear into strategy. When an empire on the council floor finally declared that humanity represented a long-term threat to stability, the words resonated not because they were true but because they fed into existing bias. Better to extinguish a flame early than allow it to become a wildfire. The vote was dressed in the language of order. Officially, it was a measure to ensure balance and prevent instability at the galactic frontier. Behind the language was a much colder truth. The Council intended to cripple humanity before it grew into something they could no longer control. The motion passed, bolstered by the promises of quick results and the illusion that the operation would remain discreet. Those few who spoke against the plan, who remembered the old warning, were silenced with accusations of cowardice or senility. Their protests were erased from the record as swiftly as they were spoken. The first strike came against a colony far from Earth, a settlement that had grown on the back of human stubbornness more than council aid. Its terrain was barren, its winds relentless, yet families had carved out homes and cultivated a world that was never meant to sustain life. To the attackers, it was meant as an example, the burning of one settlement to remind humanity of its fragility. Ships entered orbit, bombardments began, and within days the colony was ash and rubble. Survivors were dragged into captivity, displayed as proof of the Council's authority. The message was clear: submission or destruction. What the Council failed to understand was the depth of human response to loss. The sight of smoldering ruins, transmitted across the network to Earth and its colonies, did not inspire surrender. It inspired fury. Grief turned to resolve in hours, and governments that had squabbled over trade and policy suddenly found unity in rage. Leaders who once argued over borders now stood together at the podium, declaring that this was not an isolated crime but a declaration of extermination. To humanity, the Council's attack was not a punishment but an attempt at erasure. The response was not negotiation. It was war. Factories that had once produced civilian goods began operating day and night for military production. Students volunteered for service, engineers abandoned civilian projects to design weapons, and miners tore resources from asteroids to feed the growing fleet. The unity was not ordered from above, it was demanded from below. Every citizen understood instinctively that survival now required total commitment. Humanity did not rally because its leaders commanded it, but because its people refused to allow the deaths of the colony to go unanswered. In the Council's halls, the aftermath of the strike brought unease. The victory had been too easy, the silence from Earth too composed. Some whispered of the look in the eyes of the human delegation after the attack, not despair, but calculation. The ancient warning began to circulate again, repeated in hushed tones. Yet those who voiced it were drowned out by officials insisting that humans would break under pressure, that a species so young could not resist the combined power of civilizations millennia older. The arrogance that had carried the vote now blinded them to the storm gathering beyond their reach. While council leaders congratulated themselves on their decisive action, humanity prepared. They spoke little, broadcast no empty threats, and sought no immediate revenge. Their silence was not submission, it was the sharpening of the blade. The destruction of one colony had not cowed them, it had given them purpose. And though the council did not yet realize it, they had just ensured that humanity would never forget, never forgive, and never stop. The silence that followed the first strike was deceptive. To the council, it appeared as hesitation, the pause of a species too overwhelmed to respond. In reality, it was the measured intake of breath before the roar. Humanity was not shattered, it was galvanizing. Earth and its colonies, long divided by politics and distance, discovered a clarity of purpose that had never existed before. Every settlement, from the orbital cities above the homeworld to the outposts clinging to barren moons, poured their strength into one cause, survival through retribution. Factories that once built farming equipment began producing engines of war. Shipyards expanded ceaselessly, welding together frames for vessels that were never intended to be anything but weapons. Ordinary civilians transformed into soldiers, engineers, strategists. Where other civilizations required centuries to mobilize, humanity did it in months. The strength of their response was not measured in the size of fleets, but in the ferocity of their intent. Humans did not believe in stalemates or containment. Every plan, every strategy was designed around a single idea: the enemy must pay, and they must pay endlessly. Their commanders understood that they could not match the Council in raw numbers, but they had no interest in parity. Instead, they sought asymmetry, targeting supply chains, fuel depots, and transport lanes. They attacked not where the enemy was strongest, but where they were complacent. Convoys vanished into ambushes, listening posts were silenced in sudden raids, and border patrols returned to find entire stations gutted and left adrift. These early retaliations spread fear faster than destruction. The Council had expected frontal battles, set-piece engagements they could win with overwhelming power. What they received instead was a predator that never announced its presence until it struck. Human fleets slipped through trade routes like shadows, striking at weak points before disappearing again into deep space. Captains who had once laughed at the thought of human defiance now trembled at the idea of facing them in the dark. The psychological weight grew heavier than the casualties. Prisoners of war, when questioned, spoke with terrifying conviction. They described humanity's unbreakable oath, that every life lost on the colony would be avenged tenfold. Alien interrogators dismissed these statements as bravado, but in time they came to realize it was no boast. Human soldiers carried that oath not as propaganda but as truth. Entire units swore blood vows, marking themselves with the names of the dead, fighting not for conquest but for vengeance that demanded fulfillment. Council chambers devolved into bickering as reports piled up. Losses mounted not because of grand battles, but because supply lines became untenable. Worlds once considered safe suddenly felt exposed. Merchants refused to travel routes where humans had been sighted, fearing not capture but annihilation. The Council had imagined a war of control. Instead, they were faced with an enemy who sought nothing but relentless punishment. Every small victory for humanity carried disproportionate weight, eroding confidence among populations who had once believed their rulers invincible. Human tactics defied established doctrine. They fought even when outnumbered, leveraging their willingness to endure casualties if it meant inflicting greater pain. To other species, this seemed reckless. To humans, it was logical. A war of attrition favored the side that refused to stop. They learned their enemies' patterns, exploited their rigid command structures, and struck at moments when hesitation meant disaster. Stories spread of human captains who pursued enemies across multiple systems, refusing to break off even when their ships burned and their crews bled. The Council began to realize that they were not fighting soldiers in the traditional sense. They were fighting an entire species that had collectively decided that surrender was no longer an option. As the campaign escalated, the memory of the ignored warning returned with force. Delegates replayed the words of the elder emissary in private, suddenly recognizing the weight they had mocked. But the Council was already trapped. To retreat would admit weakness, to escalate further risked awakening something even worse. They had provoked a species that would not rest until the scales were balanced, and every strike humanity delivered proved that the balance they sought was measured not in treaties but in ashes. Human vengeance did not ebb with the first waves of retaliation. What began as counterstrikes matured into something far more enduring, a doctrine not written in manuals but etched into the very psyche of the species. Every family who lost someone carried that loss as fuel, every community marked by grief turned it into unyielding resolve. Generations of humans had been taught resilience through hardship, but now that resilience became weaponized. They were not content to strike back and retreat. They pursued. They stalked. They learned to turn war into a hunt with no end until the prey was extinguished. For the Council, the war transformed into a nightmare of attrition. Entire systems that once pulsed with commerce became silent. Human ships lingered unseen in asteroid fields or shadowed moons, waiting for convoys to pass. When they struck, there were rarely survivors. Merchant fleets refused to sail routes without escorts, and even escorts dissolved under the sheer persistence of human pursuit. The destruction was not random. It was systematic. Humanity was dismantling the arteries of the Council piece by piece, cutting away everything that sustained their strength. The most chilling aspect was the relentlessness. Other species fought wars within the bounds of treaties, pauses, and expectations of negotiation. Humans rejected such boundaries. Once targeted, a fleet was pursued until its last ship fell. Worlds that participated in the first strike found themselves visited by firestorms decades later, long after their leaders believed the danger had passed. No statute of limitations existed in human memory. If one generation failed to exact vengeance, the next inherited the oath. Human commanders swore publicly that as long as even one survivor of the burned colony lived, the war would continue. It was not rhetoric. It was policy. Captured prisoners told of encounters where human crews ignored opportunities to seize resources or territory, focusing instead on annihilating enemies tied to the original assault. They spoke of commanders who chose pursuit over safety, of soldiers who fought past the point of reason because surrender was not an option. The Council realized too late that humanity's objective was not victory in the traditional sense. It was punishment. Victory was merely a side effect. When humans reclaimed the destroyed colony, the act was not a conclusion but a spark for further escalation. Survivors were freed, their accounts of torture and humiliation broadcast across human networks. Entire populations wept and hardened their resolve simultaneously. Rebuilding began immediately, not as an act of defiance but as a declaration: humanity does not stay broken. The ruins became a monument, and every child raised there was taught the names of those responsible. They grew up not with sorrow but with fire in their blood, prepared to continue the hunt if their parents could not finish it. The Council fractured under the weight of this relentless pressure. Some member species refused to commit further resources, unwilling to risk their fleets against what they now called the deathless foe. Others tried to negotiate privately with humans, seeking to remove themselves from the list of targets. But humanity's response remained consistent: words could not erase actions. Species that had lifted a hand in the attack were marked, and no amount of apology could erase the oath of vengeance. Neutral parties watched with growing unease, realizing that the prophecies spoken in the chamber had not been superstition but inevitability. Whispers spread across the stars: humanity does not forgive, humanity does not forget, and humanity does not stop. Their pursuit crossed borders and ignored treaties. They would track down raiders across nebulae, follow admirals across sectors, and dismantle entire dynasties because of a single signature on the original order to strike. What the Council had unleashed was not an enemy bound by diplomacy, but a predator unleashed into the galaxy, one that hunted with the patience of ages. As fleets burned and alliances crumbled, the ancient warning resurfaced in full clarity. The emissaries' words were replayed in hushed chambers, no longer mocked but recited with dread. Every delegate now understood what they had dismissed: that humanity's vengeance was not a storm to be weathered, but a fire that would burn until nothing remained of those who had provoked it. The Council had thought themselves the apex of civilization. Now they realized they had awakened something they could not tame, a hunter that would pursue them across generations, across the very stars themselves. The culmination of the war did not arrive with a single decisive battle but with the slow, grinding collapse of the Council's authority. What had once been a coalition of proud civilizations was reduced to fractured voices, each demanding protection while offering little in return. Humanity had stripped away their sense of invincibility, turning their fleets into prey and their alliances into liabilities. The empire that had pressed hardest for humanity's destruction found itself isolated as others withdrew, desperate to avoid the crosshairs of vengeance. Yet isolation did not save them. Humanity had marked them from the beginning, and no retreat could erase the record of their crimes. When the final campaign began, it carried with it the weight of years of suffering and the momentum of unbroken resolve. Human fleets did not simply attack, they advanced with precision, dismantling orbital defenses, seizing supply depots, and cutting communication before the enemy fully understood the scale of the assault. Entire star systems loyal to the Empire fell in rapid succession, not because they lacked strength, but because their will had already been broken. Rumors of humanity's endless pursuit spread faster than any military report, and soldiers abandoned posts rather than face opponents who did not accept surrender. The Empire's homeworld became the symbol of their downfall. Once considered untouchable, shielded by layers of defenses and centuries of accumulated wealth, it became the stage for a reckoning. Humanity did not bombard indiscriminately. They dismantled defenses piece by piece, making it clear that nothing could stand against their determination. Cities that had laughed at the thought of human retaliation watched their skies burn. Palaces that had once hosted rulers who voted for extermination crumbled under the precision of strikes aimed not at civilians, but at symbols of power. The message was unmistakable: justice delivered without compromise. When the rulers were dragged from their sanctuaries, there were no grand speeches, no negotiations, no appeals for mercy. Humanity had no interest in theatrics. Execution was swift, the blade of retribution falling without hesitation. For every human lost in the first colony, a voice had demanded this outcome. The Empire's end was not celebrated as triumph but recorded as closure. Humanity had not fought for conquest or territory. They fought to ensure that those responsible would never draw a breath again. The Council, once the seat of authority across countless systems, dissolved in silence. Delegates who had shouted for decisive action now fled into obscurity, hoping to distance themselves from decisions they had once championed. Records of debates were erased, archives sealed, but the truth could not be hidden. The galaxy knew what had happened. They knew who had begun the conflict, and they knew who had finished it. The Council's dissolution was not an official decree but the natural consequence of shame and fear. No species wanted to sit in chambers that had ignored the warning and invited annihilation. Humanity's final message carried across every channel, reaching allies, neutrals, and adversaries alike. It was not a threat, nor was it a plea for recognition. It was a statement carved into the annals of history. We did not seek this war, but we will finish any war forced upon us. If you raise your hand against humanity, understand that we will not stop until you are broken. It was not spoken with pride but with cold certainty, the tone of a species that had endured too much to be deceived again. From that day onward, humanity's reputation became legend. Children of alien worlds grew up with cautionary tales warning them never to provoke the hunters from Earth. Diplomats approached human representatives with care, measuring every word, aware that missteps could reignite the fire. Even species untouched by the war carried the lesson: to challenge humanity was to invite an enemy that would never forgive and never rest. The prophecy had come full circle. The elder emissary's words, once dismissed as superstition, became scripture for the galaxy. Do not attack the humans. They will hunt you forever. Every corner of civilization remembered it, not as myth but as law written in blood and fire. The Council had ignored it, and in doing so, had sealed its own destruction. Humanity did not seek vengeance as a fleeting act, it pursued it as destiny. And the stars themselves bore witness to the truth that would echo for eternity.